Alright, welcome back to another Tennille Teaches the 12 Principles of Animation. Now we're going to look at one of the principles that a lot of people get confused about, straight ahead versus pose to pose. Now the reason I chose this principle for this particular animation is because I actually used quite a bit of both techniques in this animation. Just to cover our bases here, straight ahead versus pose to pose is more so between two work methods of animation. So I'm going to play through what was my first work in progress that I rendered out for this animation. Alright, now you'll see that some of this is done pose to pose. Pose to pose meaning I did my keyframes, so I knew I wanted to start with Tiger Star looking this direction, having his mouth wide open. I knew that one, I wanted that to be a shot. This is just getting the storytelling of the animation in here, so that I can later go back in and fill in all the spots where Tiger Star should be moving his head around, or his ears, or his eyebrows in this case, the lip syncing, and all of that. Then you'll see Dark Stripe come in, and Dark Stripe pretty much looks, I mean, of course he's in rough animation right now, but his animation is almost exactly how it is in the final animation. And this is because I did him straight ahead, meaning I started with this frame. Yes, I started with this frame, and then I moved to the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, and I just drew those images side by side along as I went. I didn't go from this drawing to this drawing to this drawing, and then filled in spaces in between like I would if I did pose to pose. But Tiger Star mostly is done pose to pose, Dark Stripe is done straight ahead, until we get here, where I did all of these straight ahead. And some of you might be saying, well, why don't you just do everything straight ahead? Because it already looks like you have almost a finished animation in here. And some people do work straight ahead all the time. But it is not recommended, especially if you are a beginner, because working straight ahead tends to mean you aren't keeping your shapes aligned correctly, and it overall, if we watch things like Tiger Star's head here, you'll notice it starts to get a few weird shapes as it goes along. And I fixed a lot of this before I rendered this out, but when I first did these drawings, Tiger Star kept changing shape. He would grow or he would shrink, and that's often a problem of doing straight ahead, is because you're just looking at the last frame and you're not looking at the animation as a whole. Even there, he kind of grows, and I know when this frame was first when I first rendered this frame, he was much bigger and he was way out of line with his proportions as compared to the rest of the animation. And then he goes back to pose here. The benefit of doing pose to pose is that you don't lose that mass. You're less likely to have the head shrink or grow or do anything silly like that, because you have fewer drawings, but you're spacing them out throughout the entire animation, and you're making sure you have little checkpoints to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. The problem with pose to pose, though, is that it can start looking a little stiff or robotic if you just start drawing in between every single frame the middle drawing of these two frames. So like if I went from this to this, that would mean in my middle I'd want to draw something that looked like it was in between these two. And that's not keeping, like that's not good animating. If you start pose to pose to get all your action in there, and then you can do straight ahead afterwards, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is the final rough animation for this piece. This is before line art and coloring comes in, so this is just my rough line art. And this is after I've done everything else. And you can see that this looks quite a bit like the finished product. Now, after I had done pose to pose in my first pass, that's when I go back in and start to do things straight ahead, especially stuff like the lip sync. It's almost always best to combine straight ahead and pose to pose to get the most natural looking outcome. The only time you want to strictly do straight ahead is for things like Dark Stripe here, or things like Tiger Star's turnaround. And that's because, you know, these are very fast, and you want them to be fluid movements that can be sometimes hard to map out if you're trying to work pose to pose. It also gives this really loose kind of free vibe to it, which makes it look really nice. But if I would have tried animating this entire thing straight ahead, it would have turned out to be a total mess.
I'm a superstar, kick down the door, got the money and the bills, and I'm also so humble. I'm a superstar, kick down the door, got the money and the bills, and I'm also so humble.